Well, it plans to make a major event of the 100th year because in any organization, 100 years is a long time, particularly organizations like the RSS. So I know you're doing now in the research you're doing. One of the interesting things to me was even then is many of the leaders to be went often first after their RSS training, the Shaka training. They went into the Vijati Parishad. And in the modern era, the short pants, were looked at as something young people wear, not something men wear, So, and then the other thing is participation of women in the RSS. And they've got a complex response to that. And not enough has been written by Deoras, about Deoras.
Yes.
You have within the organization, pamphlets and other things in some of his talks, but in the larger society and certainly internationally, not much is known. And he I totally agree with you, that he set the organization on a much more dynamic path. Classes began to come in as well, sometimes for their own self-interest, sometimes because they genuinely felt they could add something to the country through the RSS. They're too hard because they know it has such a strong element of support in this country. When my wife, who is a Hindu, by the way,
Yes.
married me, there were some people in her family that, oh my goodness, technically I am a Christian,
Yes.
though we had a Hindu ceremony. Who couldn't see the importance of doing this. Now, I know some other people, in the RSS who are married to foreigners as well.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Historically Speaking. This is a podcast which takes us through an interesting journey in history where we have interesting conversations with interesting authors and guests. Today we have a very special guest, Walter Andersen, who is a distinguished writer and author who has studied the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or as everyone knows, the RSS, very deeply. He's someone who has studied it over a long period of time. And this is a very special year for the RSS as it celebrates its 100th year. It was an organization that was founded in 1925 in Nagpur. And Walter is one of the authorities on the Sangh, as I can clearly say with full authority on this point. So thank you, Walter, for taking out time and speaking to us. I have some very significant questions for what seems to be a very significant year for the RSS. One of the first questions is related to its core, which is how does the RSS see its 100th year and the road ahead for the organization?
Well, it plans to make a major event of the 100th year because in any organization, 100 years is a long time, particularly organizations like the RSS, to last and in fact to grow stronger over time rather than weaker or have divisions. And how I got interested in the RSS was my advisors at the University of Chicago were advising me on a doctoral dissertation. And initially I was going to do on student politics in India. But they said, no, other people have done that. If you want something really unique, why don't you do a study of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh? And they were impressed by the fact that this was an organization which is not split, because many Indian organizations find unity difficult. Particularly social organizations like the RSS, or one could even say a quasi-political organization like that. And it had not split. And they said, why don't you, do a study on what keeps this organization together? What has been its strength? So I decided to do that. I decided to focus on the RSS. And when I first came to India, people were saying that, most or many Westerners, and also a lot of Indians, have a very prejudiced view, biased view on it because it doesn't conform to a number of things that they think appropriate for politics. I was staying at Jubilee Hall at Delhi University, and the students, they were split as well. There were some pro-RSS students who had come from the Vijati Parishad, which is their student group, and there were quite a few who were very much opposed to it as well. So I then began making, an approach to the RSS through these students initially. And they introduced me to the person who was in charge of the RSS in the Punjab, Delhi area. And he had an interest in philosophy. And one of my philosophy teachers, political philosophy teacher at the University of Chicago, was Leo Strauss, one of the experts in the field, who he had read about and was impressed by. It just so happened I had a book by Leo Strauss, signed by Leo Strauss, and I gave it to him. And in one of our meetings, maybe the third, we met maybe once a month or something like that, once every 3 weeks. And I would talk about what I knew about Western philosophy, and he would talk about Indian philosophy as he knew it, and we'd compare notes. Then maybe at our second or third meeting, he said, "How would you like to meet Guru Gowalkar?" And I said, fine. I said, my advisors at the University of Chicago had actually met him as well. And I think they were the first foreign scholars who they agreed to visit with Gowalkar. So I did. And I went there and I would meet with him in the mornings and the evenings, and we would talk about a whole range of things. And but in those conversations, he talked about looking to the future to this year. That was many years ago. And he said, when we're 100, we should be able to sort of think about what we have done in India, and we should be an organization that is together. And let me tell you what I think keeps us together. And maybe we can get into that, because then that began our conversation as to what kept together. And then he said, what you really need to do is test this out. Go to shakas, the meeting places of the RSS, and meet people who are leaders or who are students at the shakas and get their views as to it. And he said, I'll get you, I'll write a note, one in English and one in Hindi, because not everybody may be enthusiastic about talking to you. And that was certainly true. In fact, one case I remember with a person who was a leader in the old city of Delhi, I went to see, and he said, and then I pulled out this letter, and he looked at it, the Hindi letter, and he said, come back tomorrow and I'll give you an answer. And obviously what he was going to do to see if this letter was real or not. So communicate with Nagpur. Did he really write this letter? Well, of course he had found out that he did. So I came back, he said, okay, sit down. And that was the start. And so I really had, because of that meeting, I had, I'd say a very successful research. And I was here for almost 3 years doing research all over the country. In fact, the person who helped translate, I could get by in Hindi, but when I first went to my first interview in the old city, and I said, he asked me, well, how is your Hindi? And particularly, there's a certain kind of Hindi they speak there. Oh, I said, I think I'll get by. He said, no, you won't. I will go with you. And he did. Well, I happened to have lunch with him 2 days ago here. He's still around. His name is Ram Chowdhury. And he comes from a Marwari family, and I got to know his family fairly well and him. We've kept in touch, but he translated for me, and it's a good thing he did go. But it was the start of kind of field research after having visited Nagpur. So, all research you really have, particularly social research, you really have to have hands-on research in which you meet people. And I was fortunate I had that letter, and then I had met Gowalkar, because it opened up the door. And then I had a person who had become my collaborator, Sridhar Damle. Yes. And he, he knew the organization very well. And in places in Maharashtra, he was able to do translation for me as well. And I had someone in the South, who a Tamil speaker, who helped me. But they looked at this because, in their view, if it was 100 years that they had survived as an organization, that was something that was a major advantage as an organization, that it could stay around that long and have influence. And he said, well, we'll see. That was, many years ago. We'll see if that happens, but that is our goal. Is not, he said, not just 100, but beyond 100. That, do we continue to exist as a viable organization? And then he said, find out, your view. And I tried to find out, and it's still around now, and it's stronger now than it was 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And so the books I've written about the RSS have been in attempts to show what is it about the organization that enables it to be a cohesive organization that has, significant influence. And as you know, it's a growing influence as well. And that's one of the issues. And even he had to recognize that was an issue they had to be concerned with, that it wasn't looked as if they wanted to sort of install some kind of authoritarian regime, because that's been a charge against them. So anyway, we can talk about that, any aspects of what I think keeps it together and influential.
It's a 100-year-old organization with a history and a particular trajectory, and it has evolved in response to the changes in Indian society. Yes. So how do you see the RSS in its 100-year-old trajectory?
It's very optimistic. Its leadership is quite optimistic about what the future has to bring, in part because from the beginning, when its founder, Hedgewar, laid down the organizational framework of the RSS. And then one of his successors, Deoras, so built on that. And each of the Sarsanghchalaks, the heads, have added something to it. And they've created an organization which is able to train. It's very good at training people and motivating, and therefore you have a lot of people who've gone through their system, very loyal. Now, it makes certain demands, and therefore there is an attrition rate, because not everybody wants to go through the demand. Like, particularly when you're younger, going to a shaka, which is the meeting every day in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, means you have to get up. And particularly if you have school or other things, that has to come after. But you go to the shaka, and if you miss the shaka, they often go by and why did you miss? Trying to see, are you really loyal to the organization that's needed? And for them, loyalty to the organization is not only building bonds with the group that you're working with in the larger organization, but it's building a kind of patriotism, loyalty to the country. That's what the hope is, that, you have that. And, and that loyalty and that training, will help. And Hedgewar, and particularly Deoras, saw it important as India is, getting increasingly complex. And it's what it does. We need organizations that address these complexities of Indian society. And one of the first was the student group. And after the Second World War, the Vidyarthi Parishad, you had a significantly large number of the children of RSS members or RSS members themselves, who were students, and particularly college students. And so the Vidyarthi Parishad organized itself to, in a sense, develop stronger loyalty among students, and ideas about how the students of India, and everyone knows students often are the most committed people in society to getting things done, most idealistic. How can we make use of this factor to build us an organization? And if you look at the RSS and some of I know you're doing now in the research you're doing, one of the interesting things to me was, even then, is many of the leaders-to-be went often first after their RSS training, the Shaka training, they went into the Vidyarthi Parishad, because many went to college, and they would organize, at college. And so if you look at the leadership over time, and where did they spend their first field training? It was in the Vidyarthi Parishad, because not only was it a student group, that was, so their minds were focused on what they considered important, learning how to, be people who could strengthen India. And then you have, I won't go through all of them, because there are about 34 such organizations, which are kind of formalized, but then you have another 60 or 70 kind of quasi-organizations that are linked to it. They even have one for Muslims, for example. They have another organization for farmers. They have one, the Mazdur Sangh, for workers. And maybe we can go into this later. These organizations don't always agree with leadership, which is something that a lot of people who look at the RSS, see it as a highly centralized organization where everybody has to follow through what the leadership thinks or does. Now, it is true when the RSS comes to a decision on something, they do expect people to follow that. But the interesting thing to me was the process of coming to that decision, because it's always by consensus.
Yes.
That, before they come to a decision. So some issues are always put on the side. For example, the issue of labor was one issue that has created some differences. And so they have put that aside. And what's happened is, instead of the central government, now that the BJP is in power, and even when it had first in power with Vajpayee, they had some problems with the way that others looked at, the responsibility of labor in the larger Indian context. I'll give you a humorous example of that. If you look at the latest book that we did on the RSS, it has men in long pants.
Yes.
Whereas the first book has people in short pants.
Yes.
And the question is, why the difference? It took them years to come to a decision on that. And they couldn't come to a decision until there was a kind of unanimous opinion, because, in the world of organizations and ideas, actually clothing counts.
Yes.
What you wear counts. And people were saying, no, we've been doing this since 1925 or 1928, I guess, is when they introduced the uniform. And so to change it would create problems for some people. Well, they've changed it, and has it created problems? Did they lose members because of it? And if they may have lost a few, but not many, people went along. And in the modern era, the short pants, were looked at as something young people wear, not something men wear. So, and then the other thing is participation of women in the RSS, and they've got a complex response to that. There is a women's equivalent of the RSS, and that's been around for a long time. In fact, Hedgewar was helped to respond to encourage the lady who was responsible for that to organize something like that. A rather remarkable lady, by the way, who was a widow with children, who was not from a wealthy family, but yet, she devoted herself and organized her life in a way that was kind of inspiring for many women, particularly in Maharashtra initially, and to a certain extent among Brahmin women, though it moved far beyond that when it began to be organized. So, you had, an organization that you had a certain women's wing, that not all, but most of the affiliated groups of the RSS have women participation. Now, the RSS is male as such, but it works with women on projects. And in the US and some other countries, the shakas actually combine men and women. As far as I know, that's still not the case as such yet, though there are organizations in which they do work together. In fact, even some activities where the RSS involved, like Seva activities, you have men and women who are involved in that. And in the US, and I think in the UK, the Shaka actually have women and men together. The US is certainly the case.
So when you talk about leadership and leadership ironing out the differences and coming to a consensus, what role does the Sarsanghchalaks play? And they've had series of different Sarsanghchalaks with very different diverse personalities.
Yes, and I think this is something that you're going to be looking at very closely.
Yes.
And of the several Sarsanghchalaks, they've all been different. From the founder, Hedgewar, who actually had close links to the Hindu Mahasabha of its time, and who had strong views on politics and freedom of India and India from the colonial situation. Then you had his successor, Golwalkar, who was in many ways very saintly, very philosophically oriented, and he's perhaps best known now because he had to sort of keep the RSS alive in the post-Mahatma Gandhi killing. And he was able to do that, but I think in part by having the stance of a person who focused on religion and kind of philosophic views. Then you had Deoras, who was much more like Hedgewar, who thought that the RSS needed to go into all sorts of areas. And under his leadership, many of these affiliated groups were organized. As I said, the first one, he didn't take a direct role in organizing that, was the Vidyarthi Parishad, the student group. But then you had all these others as well that came up. And sometimes, as I said, they've had differences from not only I shouldn't say different from, but somewhat critical of the stance of the RSS or lack of a stance on an issue. But they have had problems with the BJP government. The BJP, of course, is the second name of their political affiliate. The first was the Jana Sangh. And for example, the labor affiliate occasionally has gone on strike with communist labor unions and others against policies of the government. More recently, the whole farmer issue. You have the farm organization of the RSS has taken a very independent stand on that. So they often sort of look at issues from the perspective of that organization. And that doesn't, that sometimes means it's difficult to reach this consensus of opinion. But they try to do so. And as I said, in the labor case, was a compromise. The states could decide, what stand they would take before the central government did, because there were divisions of opinion on that.
I see Balasaheb Deoras as a very fascinating Sarsanghchalak because he brought about fundamental changes and opened up the organization. And he stands out as a person in history. How do you see from that to Mohan Bhagwat, the trajectory from Balasaheb Deoras to Mohan Bhagwat?
Yeah, not enough has been written by about Deoras. Yes. You have within the organization, pamphlets and other things in some of his talks, but in the larger society and certainly internationally, not much is known. And he was, I totally agree with you, that he set the organization on a much more dynamic path. And I think that Golwalkar really thought the organization should go in that post-ban period into something more dynamic. And Deoras was able to do that. And then, he had friends in all sorts of groups in the country and was able to sort of work with them to get things done. A rather remarkable man. And he knew how to lead.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to the book that you're going to be writing on that subject, because he, I think, will play a major role. And now we come down, before him, the leaders at that level, including the Sarsanghchalaks, had been Maharashtrian Brahmins, heavily Chitpavan. Not totally, though. Heavily. I think Golwalkar was not a Chitpavan. I think he was Deshista, if I'm not mistaken. But then you had, one of the successors was from Uttar Pradesh, not Maharashtra, Rajendra Singh, and who was not a Brahmin.
Yes.
So that was I don't think they did that deliberately, though I think some did want someone who could show that we're not an organization, at least at the leadership level, which is confined to Maharashtrian Brahmins. And now you have the present Sarsanghchalak, who in some ways I think reminds me of all his predecessors. The two I think of is Hedgewar, the founder, and Deoras, because the same sense that we need to try to organize society in ways that strengthen the country and that improves what we're going to do. And for those people who are not acquainted with the RSS as well as you are, they should read the Vijayadashmi speeches.
Yes.
Which comes.
That is an idea you gave me the last time we had a conversation.
Right.
You said if you want to understand, you need to go back to the Vijayadashmi speeches and all of them.
All of them, and they every year.
Yes.
In October, November time period,
yes.
It's the Sarsanghchalak gives this speech. It's a kind of State of the Union, to use an American example, of the U.S. president. It's the RSS's kind of State of the Union.
Yes.
Where are we at and where should we go? And I noticed this last one, there's a heavy emphasis on let's be more cooperative with each other. and some subsequent speeches, and this is one approach he's taken that did arouse some opposition. He says, just because you find a lingam underneath a mosque doesn't mean you tear down the mosque.
Yes.
And a lot of people say, oh, what is he saying? Because I think he saw that kind of approach as destabilizing to India.
Yes.
That what India needed was a more cooperative approach,
Yes.
and Indians need to be more cooperative. And you do have, starting with Deoras, though the numbers are small, but now more coming in, more Christians and Muslims are participating within the organization. This is something that Deoras felt strongly about, because we have to be able to sort of say to people, we are an Indian organization, rather than one that's simply limited to Hindus in the religious sense. But then even that is complicated. How many Hindu groups are there? Hundreds. And in many ways, in fact, my wife and I had a discussion yesterday at this event we went to about what is it that makes one a Hindu. And I think there must be a million opinions as to what makes one a Hindu. I think at the end of the day, somebody was mentioning something which I tend to agree with, is that you have Hinduism as popularly thought of is a kind of reflection on culture that has grown up in a certain area. And it can have lots of parts to it. And what we know of as Hinduism does have lots of parts to it. When I think of the dedication of the Ram Temple at Ayodhya, you must have had at least 100 schools of Hinduism represented there. And then some outside Hinduism were there. Many of the skilled artists were Muslims and Christians who worked on that as well. So, I think the important thing was that, we have to, at the end of the day, we have to be loyal, patriotic to the country and to building up the country we have. Now, there's a dilemma here, because if you limit it just to India, then much of what the RSS has long talked about, the Vishwaguru idea, that, that we have something to say to the world, not just to Indians who live in this area. And so what does that mean? And I think that's yet to be worked out. I think you're going to hear a lot about that in the various celebrations of the 100 years, is where do we go from just trying to build up India, trying to make us being proud of being Indian and doing things that advance Indian society. What do we do internationally? And in fact, the President Sarsanghchalak has talked about the difficulties that you have in the Gaza Strip between Israelis and Hamas. And in fact, in much of the Middle East, you have real instability. So what do you do about that? Now, this is rather new. The RSS, in any serious way, has really not addressed that issue, though I think they're being forced to do so because this is a stream of ideas, this Vishwaguru idea, that has long been, with the RSS, though they haven't really developed it to the way that it's meaningful. I think you're going to find more people doing that in the future. And I think this 100th year celebration, you'll find more people addressing that issue.
What we have seen of the RSS over the years, whether it was the 1948 ban and then we had this 75 ban, the RSS has gone through a whole lot of challenges as an organization. Now, with the coming of technology and the access to data, which everyone has a phone, everyone is open to interpret the information coming their way because there's a plethora of information coming on your mobile phone. Now, this is a new challenge. So how does the RSS plan to address the challenges of what modern technology or opening up offers in that sense?
They actually have, some of their organizations do address the issue. In fact, the President Sarsanghchalak in his Vijayadashmi speech actually addressed that as well as an issue. Didn't go into a great deal of detail because the idea of people communicating through the internet has become very widespread.
Yes.
And especially in this country, but the US, in many places, has become for many people, it's the major way to communicate is through the internet. And it opens up an enormous means of getting your views across, but it also has some dangerous aspects to it as well.
Yes.
And I think that they're now beginning to address that seriously. Is what do you do, and how to handle this question of increased communication that the internet provides us, and other forms of communication. It's like, what did people do when newspapers became common in the 1500s and 1600s? It was a similar sort of issue, and it has both a moral as well as an intellectual element to it.
What I've seen is also that in his Vijayadashmi speak, he spoke about the dangers of woke culture at different universities, because you said that he's one of the main areas where the RSS young cadres move is the Vidyarthi Parishad, and universities and institutions have become centers of whether it's India or whether it's international, and since his outlook is largely international also in a certain sense, the rise of wokeism and all this sort of rebellious culture and questioning and everything. So a lot of things are going to be up for questioning. And how will it address that challenge? Because the Dashmi spoke about
that, yes. Yeah. It was interesting because I hadn't seen him so directly mention this as an important concern.
Yeah.
But what he said in the Vijayadashmi speeches always indicate that where the leadership thinks that the organization should be headed, what it should be looking at. And this is obviously one area. It's a very complex area. What it should be looking at is how to handle this increased in communication, where people can say and do almost anything that they want, particularly in a country like India, which is a democracy, which values free speech. For several years, as you know, I taught in China. And one had to be careful what you said through the internet, because you knew that somebody would be looking at that. And when I communicate with people I still know in China, I have to be very careful what I say, because it could be looked at and could get the other person in trouble. But in India, you have almost freedom to do that. And there are some limits, of course, and there are everywhere, but there are not many. And so how to use that in a way to improve the message that you have, and to improve connectivity. And one of the things that the RSS has long thought of itself as doing with all these various organizations that work with it is how do you link people together? And as it's grown in size, it becomes even more complex. You now have, when the organization is first 30 or 40 years, was mainly urban, mainly high caste, mainly, middle class. It has since expanded much beyond that. And is now, maybe 20 years ago, it began to get, some people who were, from the wealthy classes began to come in as well. Sometimes for their own self-interest, sometimes because they genuinely felt they could add something to the country through the RSS. So you now get a much broader situation, and particularly for organizations that work on consensus, they have to convince each other that what they want is something that's good for the country to do. Now, every year, beside the Vijayadashmi speech, they have a kind of annual meeting of the various branches of the RSS, where it's a sort of a place where, or an occasion where these issues are approached and addressed. So what do we do? And particularly an organization that has linkages through the governing party, the BJP, but it has linkages to some, like the largest student group in India, the Vidyarthi Parishad, the largest labor union, the Mazdoor Sangh, and a whole range of others that address various specific issues. Like one organization addresses the issue of women in business. And, what does that mean to have women in business? Some unique problems and issues that come up in that. My wife, who is an Indian woman in business, that there's a certain kind of rudeness that sometimes is expressed,
of course,
because they're a woman.
Yeah.
And so that's one of many kinds of issues that you have with women. But then you have lots of other you have the largest non-government school system.
Yes, they do.
In India. And in fact, maybe we can talk about this later, but people talk about the political input of the RSS, and there is political input. For years they tried to deny it, but it was always there. More so later. But what is the main impetus to that political input? It's these various affiliated groups. These groups have specific interests. Let's take education. They have certain views about what should happen in education, particularly improving rural education. This is a big thrust of their school system, is how to have a more effective education for people in rural India, so that they're better farmers, better handled their own, economies, and make a better contribution to society. It's that which the RSS as an organization sees as its goal to try to address these issues, not as if they have all the answers. I've met almost no RSS persons who, unlike the ex cathedra that you have in another organization, where you speak kind of as if you're speaking from the voice of God. I've never heard anybody say that. But they have talked about debate. And now debate is, the issue of debating ideas is a long tradition in Hinduism. And now the Kumbh Mela is about to happen. You're going to find that. I went many years ago to a Kumbh Mela, and I was amazed that I didn't expect it. You would have meetings set up where people would debate. I think it's A, and certain, another group said, no, it's B, and debated. That's an old tradition in Hinduism. And it doesn't, people, at least I know of, don't think that this is a sign of the organization of Hinduism as a group of ideas is falling apart. In fact, if anything, it's a strength of the organization.
The other aspect that I feel, which is connected to the point that you were talking about, the expanding base of the RSS. Initially, it was largely a higher caste, and now it has expanded much more beyond the initial urban middle class and urban rich who were drawn towards the organization. How does the Sangh see Bhimrao Ambedkar as, because he's one of the largest, the Dalit icon, and he continues to be. Of course, he's also the architect of Indian Constitution.
Right.
So that with Ambedkar performing multiple roles and as a multifaceted personality, he was very critical of certain aspects of Hinduism and other things. So how does the Sangh see Ambedkar?
They would agree much of his criticism, by the way, on Hinduism, as it has been practiced, and still is in some aspects of it. I think that they were as, what's the word I want to use? Not confused, taken aback by both his criticism, as was people in the Congress Party as well. There was another sort of sense among some who felt that he was too critical. And there are probably some, in fact, I know that there are some who still think that. What produced the change? I think as the organization spread and began to sort of look at the issue of Dalits and other people of the lower caste, lower end of the caste hierarchy, that they began to appreciate more of what he had in mind. He was not advocating the breakup of India. He was not even advocating a social revolution as such. He, in many ways, was advocating something that probably the RSS leadership today would agree with. Is he respected? Yes, probably more than ever before, and not only just the RSS, but other organizations in India as well. Partly because he was the author of the Constitution, and partly because of his influence among a large part of the Indian population, the Dalits, people at the lower end. And to see a social change that's taking place within the RSS as well as its political affiliate. Look at the Prime Minister of India. He's not a high caste Hindu. He is obviously a Hindu, but he's not a high caste Hindu. And you find many others who come from lower end of the hierarchy as well. And what they have advocated is that we need to sort of build each other up so you don't have poverty, so you don't have illiteracy. And, and what has that got to be addressing more than anybody else? Groups where you have high degrees of poverty and high rates of illiteracy, like as you do among many Dalits. And their view is that we need to sort of address that issue. Because what we want at the end of the day is a strong India.
What I've understood of my understanding of the RSS and the research that I've done so far is there's still much to be understood about it.
Yes.
And in terms of an organization and the kind of work it does. Having gone to a few shakas, and again, we come back to you, and you told me the best way to understand the RSS was to also understand the shaka
Yes.
as being the core of
Yes.
the organization. But I, from my experiences of having attended a couple of shakas in Delhi, and of course the early morning wake up was a bit of a challenge, but was that they're very open. They have a lot of debate which happens after a little bit of the exercise session in the morning. Then they sit down, break out into groups. They have debate. They have discussions. There's a core theme that they
Yes.
kind of discuss about, and that's the theme of the day, and everyone has to give their opinion. So it is very
And that's all over the country. That
Yes.
theme is worked out in Nagpur,
yeah.
and then it goes out. You need to address this theme.
Yes. And the interesting aspect is that it is still trying to take everyone's opinions into account. And I was amazed as that they had breakout rooms of 10. And I said, so what are you going to do? We're going to break out into rooms. We're going to have these discussions. And then we're going to come back to, with what we have come to a conclusion regarding the particular issue. So what I understand it is still the very same organization, and its core remains the same, and probably that is the strength of the organization. Its core.
Yeah, its core, it looks of itself as an educational body to educate. But secondly, and is always seen, particularly as the organization had a number of these affiliated groups established, and many of them have a lot of members now, and have a lot of influence. Is how do you link it all together? And partly, when they have these kind of annual meetings where people from the various organizations come together, they do debate those. I don't know if you ever went to one of these meetings.
No.
It's fascinating. I'm sure they'd be happy to have you come.
Yes.
Because you do have debates on these sort of issues, and you have a certain perspective that the Mazdoor Sangh would have, and another perspective that the Vidyarthi Parishad may have. Now, some people have asked me the question, what about the Muslims? Now, it is true that it wasn't until the time of Deoras that Muslims were accepted into the RSS. Muslims were always accepted in the Jan Sangh and then the BJP, as well as some of the, in fact, I'd say almost all of the affiliated groups now accept both Muslims and Christians. Now, and then they have an organization set up to address issues that are of concern to Muslims, particularly one that comes to mind that I know that they have been, how do you improve both the educational and economic well-being of people in the Muslim community? Which
is one of the prime concerns today.
Yes. Now, one could argue in terms of that, that's creating, that's looking at people not as Indians, but as Muslims. Yeah. But that's because, to address this issue, you have to, you have to address as Muslims. And the other is the question of caste. Where does that fit in? And that has created a lot of debate and soul searching. Where does the caste issue, particularly when you marry within a caste? And for some people, I know too, have very specific that their children will marry within a certain caste situation. Is how do you address that issue? Since caste is such an important factor, and yet in much of the RSS ideology, caste is also something that gets in the way of what its bigger message is. And I don't think it's really worked that out yet as how you do that. Maybe many people, are reluctant to push that issue too hard because they know it has such a strong element of support in this country. When my wife, who is a Hindu, by the way, married me, there were some people in her family that, oh my goodness, technically I am a Christian,
Yes.
though we had a Hindu ceremony,
Mm.
and who couldn't see the importance of doing this. Now I know some other people in the RSS who are married to foreigners as well, and sometimes they've had this issue, but sometimes not. But it is something that has to be addressed: is where does caste fit into it? And you have some people who have within the organization, the larger Parivar, who address these kinds of issues that is problematic. One is caste. The other one is trade. Is to what extent you should have accept investment from the outside in trade. You have one organization which is by and large opposed to investment from the outside, but not all of their organizations are. So how do you address that issue, which is a big issue? And there's a whole range of other issues as well besides those two or three.
The other aspect that I've noticed, which is particularly interesting, which I was like, the Sarsanghchalak has a very important, significant position. It's almost like your Param Pujyas,
Yes.
Sarsanghchalak. And that's a tradition which goes back to the ancient Indian tradition of also the guru and the shishya sort of a thing. I think that has remained with the organization. There's a certain kind of because it spoke after the Mohan Bhagwat speech on Vijayadashmi. I happened to go for one of the breakout sessions, which was understanding the speech and trying to understand what is the message for a large section of people. And on one of the message was of the younger generation learning how to respect the older generation, which if they say it's a part of our culture, it's a part of any culture for that matter. But the RSS stresses a great deal upon this. So I think in that sense, which people don't realize a great deal, and people who understand the organization very peripherally, it's speaking of issues which are very core to our challenges as a society today. So what is your understanding of it? Like they spoke of things like respect. They spoke about the coming together as a family, as a unit, and trying to ironing things out.
Well, the more controversial one was, of course, the one that hit the press a lot, and that was what do you do about converting mosques built on top of temples?
Yes.
And his statements that this is not a good idea because what it does is it harms the bigger issue of unity and social solidarity. Well, there are going to be many such issues in the modern era, and that I'm not saying that all the RSS people, even all of its leaders, are open to challenge. Some are not. This is not surprising for an organization that big that you have that. And in fact, on another program, someone asked me, well, is the Sarsanghchalak, is he all powerful? No, he's not all powerful. He has to also engage in convincing people to do.
That's what you told me last time.
Right. You have to be engaged in convincing people. And because the organization is growing increasingly complex, the leadership has to be what they call moderate. It has to be able to be open to different ideas of that. And I can see a person who is the deputy, the general secretary of the RSS, Hossabole, Rashtriya Hossabole. He reflects that kind of openness to ideas. It's my impression as well in the times I've met him. And certainly the President Sarsanghchalak does as well. Now there has been one Sangchalak not too long ago who was less open, but he had some problems because of that. And I think the organization, as an organization, when, for example, in choosing the present Sarsanghchalak, Mohan Bhagwat, wanted someone who had a background in being able to sort of sit down with people and reconcile ideas. Now, as you know, Mohan Bhagwat had a public seminar 4 years ago in Delhi.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
And he addressed these issues. And among the things he said is there's been an evolution of the RSS. Earlier you had asked, have there been instances of disagreement? Well, there were people who disagreed. What do you mean? What Gold Walker said is that's it. history stops at that point. Well, it doesn't stop at that
It
point.
doesn't, yeah.
And a similar statement was made in the print form by Ram, his name now escapes me, one of the leading writers of the RSS. And because the organization is evolving. And in fact, in his Vijayadashmi speech, the President Sarsanghchalak, in effect, said that the organization, has to evolve with time. Now, a lot of people in all organizations don't want change.
Yes.
They absolutely refuse to look at the issue. And that has always created issues. And I think the strength of an organization, why has the RSS remained largely united?
Yes.
It's because by and large, not entirely, but by and large, it's accepted change and it's accepted debate about change. If one were to ask me now, what has held this group together for 100 years, it's the fact that its leadership has by and large been open to suggestions of change and to changing. And the very issue of consensus. You've got to sort of try to get everybody on board before moving. And that is an approach that is basically anti-authoritarian. The authoritarian approach is, I've got the truth.
And it'll all be centralized.
And it'll all be centralized. And no, it's not it. In fact, many people, particularly in the West, but also here, I'd say who misinterpret the RSS is to say this is an organization that focuses on getting the truth. In some senses it is, but not often the sense that we really mean it, that this is it, and evolution doesn't go further. Well, it does. India has changed a lot. Even in the 30 years, 40 years ago that I have gotten to know this country. My own wife, who is Indian and a Hindu, she has changed in her view. And the very fact that what she does as a woman, she runs a factory, is, a reflection of changes that are taking place in this country.
So now coming to one of the main questions, which is going to be asked even this year around, and this is something people will probably thinking about. The RSS relationship with the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is one of the core questions, and it is started especially post the 2024 Lok Sabha election results. And then we have a very senior politician and former Chief Minister and Union Minister of Maharashtra, Sharad Pawar, saying that's because of the RSS that the BJP has won the Maharashtra elections. That could be said for Haryana also, that the RSS had a big role to play. And I have seen myself, being someone who's very much interested in Haryana politics from Haryana, that the RSS has played a very central role in the BJP's victory, and especially the workers on the ground, who you don't see very often, but they work very extremely hard. So how do you see the evolution of, because you've seen it over a long period of time, the evolution of the relationship between the Bharatiya Janata Party and the RSS?
At the leadership level, it's varied. And now the effort of certainly this Sarsanghchalak is to have a collaborative relationship with Narendra Modi and the BJP. In fact, there is a person who is assigned from the RSS to be a kind of liaison to the party. So I think, it's not that there aren't differences, there are, both in terms of individuals, as well as who will be the next Prime Minister of India, and I've asked that question to many people. They've given their responses, but I said, you must never use my name when saying that. I'd say at this point, people really don't know. It's like, who is the next head of the RSS? I would say, at least at the RSS, I'm a little more confident it's going to be somebody very much like the President Sarsanghchalak. Because you have to have, but a political leader also has to have a similar quality. Political parties and the BJP is also a complex organization, in which you've got to address the issue. Not only is India represents the complexity of India. This is a country that has how many languages? Then you've got the big language divides of the Dravidian South and the Indo-Aryan North. And then you have religious. How many sects do you have in Hinduism alone? as not to speak of Christianity and Islam, where you have great deal of variety. Then you have the issue of wealth. You have a country that is now the fastest growing of the large countries of the world at 6 or 6.5%. And so you're developing a growing middle class, have their own needs and interests like education, an education that will provide jobs for their children. So it's a complex, because of the complexity of the country, you've got to be able to sort of listen to and address the complexity of India. I can see every time I come back here, particularly this area here that we're sitting in suburb of Delhi, just take the road system. The road system is enormously different than it was before. It doesn't mean they solved all problems. They aren't, because it was a huge issue that had to be addressed. But we got off at the airport when we first came, and to get to this hotel, we had to take the Dwarka Expressway.
Yes.
And it's a rather remarkable, bit of engineering that went into that. But you're finding that sort of thing all over the country. That kind of communications, in terms of transportation and the thing we were talking about, sort of internet. And the computer. This country has been one of the world's major producers of computer experts. And so that is an advantage to the country, how to encourage, both the teaching of computer sciences as well as the application of computer sciences. So it's increasingly complex country that takes, it takes certain kinds of leaders to address that. If a leader narrows their view to only a certain part of the country, and there are some people who do, and only to a certain economic section of the country, you're going to have a great deal of difficulty staying in control in a country like this, because India is getting increasingly more complicated and complex. And in some ways, when I used to teach in China, many of my Chinese students would ask questions about, when you see India developing, do you think it will catch up with us? And I said, yes, I do think it will, in part because of the complexity you have in this country,
yes,
and the openness to change that you have in this country, like more so in many ways than you have in China.
Yes.
In terms of where this country is going, I'd say it's going in much the same way it's going now. The rate can go higher or lower. And how does the RSS fit into that? It can be more supportive or less so. In fact, you brought up one of the issues where that came out relatively recently. In the Lok Sabha elections, there's no doubt that much of the RSS, both membership as well as leaders, thought, we're not going to be as enthusiastic as we have been in the past. And I think the BJP recognized that, and there was an effort to sort of, let's talk about all this, and they did successfully. And look what happened. In fact, an RSS leader told me when I said, if this issue comes up, what should I say? Say, look at Haryana and Maharashtra.
Yes.
And I said, why should I say look at those? Because in the recent state elections, in those two states, the RSS worked very hard.
Very hard.
And it made the difference. The BJP had a landslide victory.
In both.
In both.
Yes.
And who would have imagined after they, in both, had not done all that well?
And 10 years of anti-incumbency.
Yes, and 10 years of anti-incumbency.
That's a lot in India.
Right. And so I do. That is reflective of the influence of the RSF. What other? I saw a TV program, one of the leading political commentators, I won't mention the person's name, talk about how this country was developing, and then mention, of course, the BJP. The person asked, well, what is the advantage the BJP tends to have? Why, you have a prime minister in his third term. It has done so well in these two states, and you have more states coming up for polling, and it looks like Bihar, I think, is one of them.
Yes.
And so, what is it that explains it? And the person's answer was, it has an enormous infrastructural advantage. Yes. And by that, the person meant, I think, the RSS and its affiliated organizations. Yes. What other political party here or anywhere else in the world, except, maybe in some communist countries, do you have an infrastructure of cadre willing to work for you? Do you have, people who are focused on all these parts of society that you have the groups, that affiliated groups of the RSS working at? it's rare.
Yes.
It's a major advantage. And I've often wondered why other Indian political parties haven't adopted a similar situation. And some have tried, but it has not worked.
I think the problem lies with the discipline.
Yes, I think that's where the training at the Shaka counts.
Yes.
They don't have a similar system of training. And you have to have a kind of symbiotic relationship between the group that's providing the infrastructure and the political party. They don't have that.
Yes.
And there they do have, you have an organization like the RSS, which is committed not to being a political party or committed not to being a simple branch of a political party, but to working with.
Yes.
I think that's the best way to put it. I mean, there have been times in the past, both locally as well as nationally, the RSS has actually not been very supportive of the BJP in the last election, and was one case, but they have other cases where it's even more so, where it didn't work. But I think they recognize that this is an invaluable piece of infrastructure, political infrastructure, even though the RSS would never think of itself as political, but they provide, a measure of support. And we saw what the difference was.
It is a huge difference
between the Lok Sabha and these two states.
Yes. So, thank you for taking your time, Walter, to speak to us about the RSS. There are some really key factors that you have mentioned, which keeps the organization very relevant, and also its association with the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is continuing to fascinate political observers, analysts, and commentators. But I would say that there's something that I've learned from you, which is very significant as far as the organization is concerned, is that what I've understood is in order to understand the RSS and how it functions, one needs to let go of the peripheral view that most of the people have and try to understand the organization deeply, to understand its centrality in the Indian political and social system, like you mentioned, the education system and at the rural level. I think there's a long road ahead in trying to understand what the RSS actually does at the ground level, which majority of the people don't understand because the media understands the organization very peripherally.
Well, partly, as I said, it's partly the RSS's own fault because they tried to. So I think partly because of the ban, or the bans, since there was more than one. And so they tried to sort of keep it behind the screens and not, reveal exactly how it operates. I think that was always a mistake to do that. I think more people are saying that, but you still find some people in the RSS who don't think it's a good thing to be as open about how we operate. And I think that's a mistake because other people are interested. You have a relationship, the RSS has a relationship with the ruling party. People want to know, what is that relationship? And there's I don't think there's any harm in being frank.
Yes, and that relationship has worked for both very effectively. And in particularly, without the RSS support, I would have not seen Maharashtra and Haryana happening in that sense. So a great deal of credit goes on the work on the ground. Thank you, Walter, for taking our time and speaking to us. Thank you.